panelists. And
Yes.
yeah, great.
Okay,
Yes, so,
let's get started.
Oh, sure.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our CDS Lab Research Coordination Network webinar series. And this is a concluding session. We have a panel discussion today to discuss about climate and also food, energy, water nexus. We're very happy to have our graduate student, Shreya, to introduce our panelists. Shreya.
thank you very much. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the closing discussion of our webinar series, part 3 on climate, food, energy, and water nexus. Please allow me to introduce our invited panelists. Firstly, Dr. David Saylor. He's the director of the Urban Climate Research Center and professor at Arizona State University. Dr. Saylor presented a webinar on exploring heat mitigation strategies. Dr. Gerald Mills. He is a professor at University College Dublin, Ireland, and member and a former president of the International Association of Urban Climates. Dr. Mills' webinar was about climate resilient cities. Next, we have Dr. Rebecca Muenich. She's an assistant professor at Arizona State University. She's also the founder and director of Muenich Lab. Dr. Muenich presented a webinar on agricultural sustainability and desert cities. And Dr. Shenandoah Billiot, an assistant professor at Arizona State University and technical advisory member of the Climate Change Task Force for the National Congress of American Indians. Dr. Billiot's webinar focused on building community adaptations to address health implications of exposure to environmental changes. Lastly, our moderator is Jeffrey Raven. He is an associate professor in the graduate program of Urban and Regional Design at New York Institute of Technology and a member of the Research Coordination Network. Professor Raven is a specialist in the sustainable and resilient urban design, whose professional practice focuses on US and international projects and knowledge transfer. His work expands on the traditional influence and capabilities of architect and urbanists by bridging climate science, policy, and design practice. And with that, I'd like to leave the room for Professor Raymond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shreya. I really want to welcome and to all my colleagues through the RCN network. We have a very active network. Cecilia Dong is my colleague at New York Institute of Technology and is a PI on the project. The network has been addressing a number of critical systems, urban systems questions that are facing our communities around the country, from water infrastructure to food systems, and now we're focusing on. We have been focusing on climate, and climate is one of those topics that is a multi-headed animal, right? It's got so many different aspects to it, so many different challenges in relation to it, but also many opportunities. And you're seeing that actually playing out in the kind of policy work that's being evaluated all around the world as countries are grappling with how to confront this challenge. We have a group here based on what Shreya has presented that is approaching this question from a number of different angles, and so, but like I think there's a challenge here because of the really broad set of expertise here in the panel, but also a real opportunity to what I think is really important is connecting the dots. We cannot, no expert. And there are eminent experts here at the table, virtual table, but they cannot operate in isolation. They cannot operate alone. They cannot operate in a silo. They need allies. Every expert needs a broad set of stakeholders that are invested in the positive outcomes of their work. So from microclimate from David Saylor and Gerald Mills's work to the work with respect to community impact of climate adaptation that Shenandoah is focused on, to urban agriculture that Rebecca Muenich focuses on. The question is, where are those common points of where we can harness stakeholder interests, policy expertise, return on investment, leveraging heritage and culture to achieve a kind of common outcome that we all are striving for. So with that, I wanted to open up a question really from all of you. You're all scientists. You're all coming out of a scientific background. Can I ask you, just around the table, how do you see practice or community informing your research? In other words, how flipping the table around and looking at it from the perspective of community and community priorities, how does that process, or how could that process better shape your research, and also the narrative of your research, approaching it from that perspective? So perhaps we could start with David Saylor. Why don't we start with you, David? You're approaching it from the context of a very arid and challenging climate.
Sure. So I think from the context of the work that we're doing, we're focusing a lot of effort right now on trying to explore different strategies and technologies for reducing extreme heat in cities, with an emphasis on the Phoenix metro area. And so a lot of the strategies that we're deploying are strategies that are not commonplace today. And so as we try to implement these different technologies in communities, it's really critical that we have community buy-in, and that we are cognizant of not just the intended effects of our technologies that we're deploying, but also the perceptions of the community and the potential adverse consequences. So a really good example is we've been working with the city of Phoenix this past summer, so a year ago now. They put down 36 miles of residential highly reflective paving coatings. And so ASU was a partner with them to try to understand the efficacy of that technology in terms of reducing surface temperatures, reducing air temperatures. But that's not enough. We have to make sure that we can get buy-in from the community. How does a community feel about different possible adverse effects? So everything from perhaps these surfaces have less traction, so there might be issues with that. They tend to dirty or show tread marks more readily.
Mm-hmm.
They have glare issues, and so there's a whole host of sort of human impacts that are far afield from our target of cooling the city. And so I think it's really important that we as scientists work with our community partners and with the residents to really try to understand both really the solutions holistically, so that we can identify any of these adverse effects and have that factor into the design of future evolution of these technologies, for example.
Okay, so Rebecca, you're also in a similar climate as well as David. You're based in Phoenix. You're based in Phoenix. So, or right, you're in Phoenix, or right?
Tempe, yep.
Yeah. So, hot, arid climate, and you're dealing with urban agriculture and looking at the kind of carbon footprint related to that work. How does the community community priorities shape your research, and how could we possibly, or how should scientists harness the community expertise in the work that we do as scientists?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but the work that I do with farmers or in generally with stakeholders that I tend to work with, is more applied and for the purpose of answering questions that they tend to have, or providing resources and information that they need to make the decisions that they want to make in terms of sustainability. The data and the information I presented in my talk, I couldn't have done without the buy-in from farmers. And urban ag, I think in most places tends to be community driven. I think there's room to rethink that. Should it be even driven more largely by, bigger forces, but where it goes, how it's managed, who's involved is really driven by the community. And then, like kind of to the bigger picture of how I think stakeholders essentially should affect the work that I do. In a lot of the work I do is modeling, some of it's more data analysis, and I try to always have stakeholders involved because I like the applied aspect of it. But I think this was something you had pointed out earlier, how does that change your research narrative? And one of the research tracks that I currently work on is driven by a stakeholder I worked with previously asking a question that I didn't know the answer to. And but I thought that's an interesting question. And I started looking into that question, and now I'm, have built that into this really much larger research narrative that I hadn't expected to be working on. So I think there's a lot of value for us researchers to stay involved with stakeholders and to really listen to what they're asking, because that can definitely open up new avenues of questions that sometimes we don't see as researchers.
I mean, just on the value proposition of your work, at the ground level, in terms of the narrative that we just talked about, how have you gone about evaluating potential alliances outside of your sector of focus, such as alliances with the public health community, alliances with, say, the development community, and sort of economic development community? Are you able to sort of develop a narrative thread that engages with their priorities as well? And can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe the others also, with that focus in mind?
Yeah, I'll just speak briefly so others can chime in, but I feel like my involvement with stakeholders is more of like a snowball effort. So once you start talking to one, the communities are pretty connected, and that kind of helps build the network further. Attending, when I first came to Phoenix, I attended a bunch of various community events related to the work that I was interested in. So that was kind of another way that I started to help, try and get my research narrative into other domains, I suppose. But I'll let them chime in.
All right. We'll end with Shenandoah on this question, but maybe Gerald, if you could weigh in on this question as well, in terms of how do you see like other interests operating in the city benefiting from the work that you do, and how can we harness those powerful forces really that are as allies in your work?
It's a good question, because I think you have to be a little bit schizophrenic in the sense that you have to do stuff that interests you, that pushes an agenda for yourself. And often there's no obvious mapping onto the ground. And separately from that, you look for areas where you can make interventions. In my case, I've just recently worked on what they refer to as a co-creation project, which was planting trees in Dublin. So it fits in because I believe the places that are poor are occupied by people that are poor. That means they occupy poor housing. They often have very, very poor outdoor environments. But here's the thing, I'm only really valuable to those people if I'm a scientist and I can actually provide data to support them in making their fight. I'm not really valuable to them because then I'm easily pegged as someone who's political and pushing a particular agenda. So for example, in that particular project, I think it's obviously viable for the urban climate, for climate change, of absolutely no interest to the community. What their interest was the quality of the outdoor environment, where they take their children to play, etc., the holistic environment. And my job is simply provide them with the data to support that fight. There's an example where what I'm interested in mapped up with what they were interested in, but I couldn't really sort of direct a project toward, for example, the study of microclimates in the city of Dublin or how beneficial they are, because that's not, I don't see that as I see it as important globally, but it's very hard to make an argument for that in amongst all the other voices shouting at a city scale. Whereas in somewhere like Phoenix, climate is a massive driver. So I push the agenda and where I can fit in slightly off my subject area of interest.
But don't you think, I mean, you've raised 2 points, and I want to also hear from Shenandoah on this question of, you just described a kind of, Gerald, defining a desirable future. In other words, these are, you talked about parents with their children and finding parks to play in, and that there's not enough space for that to happen. And so in a way, it becomes a kind of a vision of a future that is a positive future that you could aspire to as a community person, and you as a scientist are providing the sort of value or the data that highlights why this is important from almost like ecological services perspective, practically, right?
Yes.
And David, you're very familiar with this as well, and Rebecca too, I'm sure.
I'm evening the future.
Others.
Go into the discussions with designers and partners. It's a one-sided discussion.
What do you mean?
Because the city provides information and says, this is what we have, this, you're well served. So my job is to provide them with equally professional and sophisticated evidence that they can say, no, you're wrong about that. This is what our evidence says.
Right.
But they have to push the agenda.
But don't you think, and you know, we're never totally objective, are we, as scientists? So we are, so how we frame the question, and Shenandoah, I'd be really curious about the way you frame your question, you know, your hypothesis essentially, because nobody is totally neutral. You're actually perhaps presenting a perspective, right? The question that I have then, Gerald, is that through the process, and Shenandoah, maybe I'd like you to respond to this, through the actual process of engagement, other benefits, other outcomes are revealed. In other words, perhaps while we're talking, as Gerald is talking about with respect to providing you know, more public space for the children to play and that sort of thing, there is a public health outcome that comes from this, right? There's an obesity question that maybe comes from this, where children have more place to play and get outside and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And after COVID, there was a mental health issue.
And then the
Because
mental health issue.
We had the geography defined for us. We were told to stay within 1 kilometer of our homes. So that effectively said to a citizen, everything you could possibly want to do is within 1 kilometer of your home. So this is the first time people started walking in their neighborhood, and they discovered they didn't particularly like what they saw within 1 kilometer of their home. And there was suddenly a push from, but there are side benefits. All I know is that from my own perspective, if I'm seen to be pushing an agenda, even though I might have a view of the world, then I'm less valuable to them as a scientist. I'm better off listening to them and providing the information that they need to make the argument.
Okay, so Shenandoah, just on because I know that in your presentation, you talked about importance of culture, and heritage, which is very critical in the human nation. So to what extent does a sort of a narrative that where perhaps there's a looking backwards, but also looking forwards in terms of their heritage of the tribal nation, looking backwards, but then also projecting a future. To what extent might that also help identify policies and programs through this kind of storytelling technique that could be quite, that could eventually be tested and prototyped? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So as a social worker, my initial interest in pursuing a PhD came from my practice, from policy practice, from community practice after exposure to various disasters and seeing the work that social workers do. And as I mentioned in my presentation, my specific research question came from the community because it was what the community wanted to know. And I absolutely agree that there's no scientist who could be completely objective. And in fact, social workers' mission is to pursue social justice. So from that perspective, it is already, in a sense, political. And so I'm trying to pull the different threads of your question together. So for me, it was all about the community, and in the area that they were interested in, there wasn't much empirical evidence. So I had to start with very much exploratory methods in order to contribute to science. But there's no, I have an objective hypothesis. And obviously, as a trained scientist, I can analyze the data, but I'm also doing it in conjunction with the community.
Well, I guess, okay, that's interesting. So I guess one way to, and I'm just curious how you all might approach this, but to approach the community where they live and actually address the kind of community concerns first with respect to, not talk about climate at all, not talk about climate adaptation, not talk about necessarily the impact of climate on agriculture, that sort of thing. Talk about community concerns such as access to services, such as employment, such as job training, such as economic development, et cetera, et cetera. Once we're approaching it from that perspective, I'm curious how you all might then see it bubbling up into fitting within your areas of expertise so that you can then connect those dots within those areas of expertise. For example, just as an example, David, there might be a need for economic development, job creation, in the Phoenix area. People are looking to learn new skills. Okay, so there is a need to developing shading techniques within the streetscapes of Phoenix. There is a potential, using high albedo surfaces and converting large parking lots into high albedo zones, et cetera, et cetera. These become job creation opportunities. So in other words, we're approaching it from the need for jobs, and then you're coming in eventually with a kind of relationship between the science that you're talking about, and it becomes a win-win opportunity there. And the same with Rebecca and Gerald and Dora. So any thoughts on that? And maybe how you actually engage the community in the actual process, so that they become actually part of the scientific process themselves. So for example, David, probably people have sensors, there are opportunities to use sensor technologies for urban heat, and you could have community get involved in that process as well. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. That reminds me of a project that we've done in an area of Phoenix called Edison East Lake, which is an affordable housing community run by the city. And to get that kind of engagement of the community, to really get the input of the community, myself and other colleagues really, some who are on this line, as well as like Paul Casio, have engaged in sort of these community engagement activities. We've had heat walks in the neighborhood where we try to engage the community and asking them, what it is they like about their neighborhood park, what it is they don't like, what it is they like and don't like about their ability to access transit and so forth. And so, we do have, we do have ways of linking, especially, when you go back to the idea of, jobs, one of the key concerns is that people have to be able to get from their residences to their jobs and whatnot. And so there's a lot of emphasis in Phoenix right now around cool corridors that help provide connection between housing and recreation, so parks or housing and the bus and transit infrastructure. And so I think these all work hand in hand in terms of providing the infrastructure that then allows the economy to thrive in other ways. So that's just a few quick thoughts on that.
Michael Bobker.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Jeffrey. Hi. Interesting discussion. I'm wondering, so far what I'm hearing is that the engagement of climate science to community, it seems to me is very almost opportunistic. You take what you can get. It's sort of opportunistic. And I'm wondering if there's not a research gap here around a more systematic approach for connecting climate science to what goes on at the community level. Gerald, I'm thinking of your tripartite distinction that you made in your talk between the upper atmosphere, the meso atmosphere, and then on the ground. And if there's some kind of systematic cross-cutting principles that might be involved about how climate science could be connected to community rather than this more opportunistic approach that I think we're talking about so far. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but that's what it sounds like to me.
Anybody want to weigh on
I would actually like to say something similar. I mean, so my background is from an agricultural school, and I think at non-agricultural schools, what we're missing is something like extension at agricultural schools. And in those communities, rural communities, agricultural communities, they trust and know and, look to those schools with those extension services to help them answer questions that they have in their, everyday work life or even beyond that. So I think there are some, I've seen various, and I think as you're saying, Michael, more, I forgot the term you used, but intentional engagement with the community.
Systematic, yeah.
Systematic. And like ASU, I know we have a few different options for connecting researchers and stakeholders, but it's not, across all universities, there's not like a clear mechanism where if you're a member of the community and you've got an issue, you can go to your closest university. Like there is kind of corollary with agricultural schools. So I think, that could be one way we think about addressing that gap, is something similar to that, but for any issue, could be climate issues and beyond.
I could see.
I'd say myself that missing from my education, partly of course because of my own fault, is any real training in development of policy and engagement with politicians to basically get your topic on the agenda. I think that when you talk about global climate change and then you try to operate it on the ground, there is a big mismatch because it's very, very hard for people in their personal experiences to make those direct connections. So I think we've missed a trick, maybe not at the urban scale, not talking about things more holistically. So for example, we have policies about the indoor space, about energy management in the indoor space. And then we have different policies with the outdoor space. They're completely disconnected. The mental health issue, especially after COVID, I'm immensely impressed at the amount of native geography that general practitioner doctors have about their own areas. And they're very knowledgeable about how their communities interact with their environment. But very few of these things are framed, for me, in climate terms. They're framed in broad neighborhood terms. So I'd like to see maybe less hard-nosed climate and more modify our perspective to incorporate climate into local scale neighborhood climates, which do involve social justice, greening, etc. It means, for example, in my particular city, having done this analysis of all the trees, I pointed out that half the trees were in private gardens. They were never part of any discussion about biodiversity in the city, never. Instead, it was the job of the council to look after biodiversity. So that meant there's an enormous stock of vegetation that was never included. And yet they should have been talked to and even been given subsidies to maybe not pave over their front gardens, to put in car parks, to grow trees. So that's, if you're asking me, my biggest failing is that I should have done a lot more work on understanding how urban policy is created and figured out how to insert my areas of interest within that framework, rather than trying to get the policy to fit my interests.
Well, it's not a failing. I think it's a knowledge gap or a research gap that we need to, we are in a fast changing context, and we celebrate the fact that we can identify research gaps that we can then focus on as scientists and in conjunction with practitioners and policymakers, et cetera. So I think that that's a really good positive element that you identified, Gerald, with respect to that.
Well, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
We have an organization that looks at flooding and they measure water in the rivers.
Yeah.
But they don't measure rainfall. We have an organization that measures rainfall that comes out of the sky. We have a different organization that looks at energy. We have a different energy organization that looks at air quality that doesn't measure weather, and yet you can't understand the air quality unless you have the weather. So we've actually fragmented the city environment, all these pieces. And it does make it difficult because the only issue that mattered for the people in terms of the environment was traffic and air quality. Traffic, air quality, and green spaces. I couldn't get them interested in climate change. They did not see that as a relevant issue at the scale that they were operating.
So Rebecca, just in terms of what Gerald brought up, busting silos between areas of expertise and the kinds of tools and the policies that are very specific to a fault, where they don't there's not a sort of broader understanding of the relationship between, for example, as Gerald was mentioning, climate adaptation and climate mitigation, which is a really critical. There's a bifurcation between those two elements that exist through policies, through funding streams, through expertise, through tools. So Rebecca, when you are looking at urban agriculture, for example, in an arid climate like Phoenix, how do you uh, draw from or connect the dots between, say, climate mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction, and climate adaptation, which is, how we confront an even hotter city, a city of like Phoenix. Thoughts on that in terms of the footprint question?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about there. One is, as urban areas expand, they often expand into existing agricultural areas, and I think we often forget about some of the services that those agricultural lands can provide. Cooling being one. Yes, in an arid environment, they probably use a lot of water to get that cooling, and maybe that's something we have to grapple with, but they also provide biodiversity. So I think, there's an opportunity, a sort of a missed opportunity in terms of thinking about urban green space and agriculture together, and how you can meet multiple goals with one sweep. And actually, Chingwen and I have talked about this idea for a while. We haven't gotten it going anywhere, but we have, talking about that disconnect, we have city planners who want to put green infrastructure. They might be in the water department, they want to put green infrastructure, and you have planners who want parks, and you have a community, and especially in certain parts of Phoenix, and where they want local food options. Are any of those talking to each other? No. Could they benefit from working together in a land constrained, water constrained environment? Of course. So I think that goes back to Gerald's point about the disconnections. And then I think even more broadly, when I talk to my urban colleagues a lot, there's a real disconnect between how we manage urban and rural environments. There's hardly any coordination, but both environments, both systems are reliant upon each other, and managing them in tandem is probably a better option than the siloed management that we tend to have. I mean, and then what Gerald was talking about was kind of within those systems as well. So I think those are some things we can think about moving forward and pushing forward as well.
Well, I mean, I'm just curious, just to pick up, you just mentioned something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is the kind of green infrastructure and the kind of complexity of green infrastructure in an urban context. And of course, there's issues around tree canopy cover that may be more problematic with respect to agriculture, but how could we connect those dots, do you think, Rebecca, in terms of how to, is it a question then of framing the scientific question that then touches on those three different groups that you just mentioned that are all interested in green infrastructure? Is that the issue, is to frame it in such a way so that the research actually starts to develop a kind of narrative that shows how they're tied together?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think one of the issues is that, the people who tend to work on green infrastructure are not really thinking about agriculture, and vice versa. And so when you're talking about developing research questions, you don't often get that interaction that you need to develop those integrated questions. But, Chingwen and I, along with Paul Caseo and Sarah Miro, this is something we've been trying to work on for a while, and we've gotten a little traction with, but no funding. So I think it's possible, but then you're talking about, there's a lift for the researchers themselves who may work in different spaces to come together to do those things. But then there's maybe even a bigger lift in the community space, because so the way I've seen it, partners tend to have, okay, I've got funds to do this many projects and I've got to do it by this deadline, but then your other partner has a different deadline and different priorities, and because of their funding, and coordinating those things takes more effort than just doing them individually. But I have seen successes, and not that in that specific way, but I saw in Detroit when I was in Michigan that they were doing combining multiple federal funds. So one, they had some funds for stormwater infrastructure, more green types of stormwater infrastructure, as well as bulldozing homes on vacant lands. And so they combine that funding in order to, in the basements of those homes to build green infrastructure. And I thought that was a really interesting example of how you can combine, multiple efforts that have different goals to achieve an even greater synergistic goal. I think it's possible, but I think you're right. I think it takes getting people from different perspectives in those different silos that we tend to work in as researchers. Even if we call ourselves interdisciplinary, we still tend to kind of work in our own silos together to really ask those questions, but then also, engaging multiple members of the community to advance those things, I think can take even longer.
So to pick up that point of multiple members of the community to actually advocate for this kind of research approach, Shenandoah, I mean, in terms of how we frame those questions, we were just talking about green infrastructure as a kind of, poster child for cross-sectoral, outcomes that are positive. Do you think that the kinds of tools and techniques that we could use to engage with community and to make this more visceral, like an actual, like really concrete area of research might be including kind of narrative techniques, such as, for example, what does a future look like for the Huma, nation in 2050? Like, what does that look like? And what is a day in the life of a Huma family in the wetlands of Louisiana after post 2050, multiple storms, multiple sea level rise, etc. What does that look like? And could that be a kind of a narrative sort of outcome that is a positive potential outcome, and then sort of work backwards to achieve that, learning from the past as well, to get there? Are there other techniques that we could bring to the table?
Yes. So I think I want to first start with Michael's question. I know you have to leave, Michael, but I wasn't sure what you meant by research that's opportunistic in regards to community, because from my perspective, working with communities is anything but opportunistic. It takes a lot of investment in time. And so I don't know if you meant like just because they're convenient, they're local, or, like for me, I'm a tribal member. But I just wanted to address that part, like that working with communities it should not be opportunistic.
What did you mean, Michael?
I agree. So
Yeah.
before I have to get off. Yeah. So what I meant was I was thinking of Gerald saying, well, my climate science isn't really relevant. What's relevant is the community's concern for parks, more parks closer, more green walking space. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to look at that topic and bring data that I can bring there. So that's what there's an opportunity for engagement there. That's what I mean.
It's more like connecting dots.
Not as an exploitative. I realize that's another possible interpretation, but
right.
we take our opportunity because that's what we see as available, rather than a systematic link with the science.
Sure.
And
yeah,
right.
I understand now.
Right.
And that's how I got to where my topic. And to go back to Jeffrey's question, so one of the projects that we've been working on is it's interdisciplinary, as though Rebecca just mentioned that it's interdisciplinary, but everybody still has their own siloed perspectives to address and to help build, or to address exposure to environmental changes, but to help build community level adaptations, because there has been such siloed efforts from different levels of governments, efforts to remove communities to other locations, which, and those efforts weren't even necessarily that much safer as far as coastal erosion goes. But the objective is to work with the community to help build partnerships with all these different stakeholders in order to develop their own guided adaptation, but that informs state level efforts, government, the federal government level efforts. I think
Are they, I mean, I'm putting on my architect's hat because I often work with sort of vision and image, is there a sort of like future vision that they can latch onto as a sort of desirable outcome? And this for all of you, for all of your, from the Dublins to the Phoenixes to, the wetlands of Louisiana. I mean, is there, we're in a crisis situation, right? We are facing some unprecedented challenges, climate challenges. And in the face of that, we've got real urgent needs for, people. The question then is, what, how do you provide that vision? Or how does the community provide or engage with you on that visioning process so that you have a clear arc that you're trying to get to, and then you can sort of walk backwards from there? What's your thinking about that? I mean, it's very powerful, right? In terms of the work that you do with the community, isn't it?
So, I used to be a strategic planner with government offices. And so like the saying is that like you can have this vision for, 25 years from now, but in 10 years, situation may be changed completely. So you have to keep adding to the vision. But that is part of the work that we've been doing, is holding community meetings and focus group meetings to be able to understand what the community's vision is. And what we're finding is that the community as a whole doesn't have the same vision. So people who live closer to the Gulf really want to stay closer to the Gulf. The people who have moved away want more of what would be a city life or an urban life vision. And so there's not a consistent vision. So it has to be broken down by where their geography is.
Right. What about the others? David, what's the vision for a cool Phoenix in 2050?
Yeah, so I think the whole vision question needs to be couched in terms of, what are the desirable outcomes? What is it? So, you often hear, city planners talking about, targets of reducing the urban heat island effect by, 3 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, kind of like what Los Angeles has done. And yet they have there's no link between that and the actual societal outcomes that we care about. So health outcomes or, any sort of quality of life type metrics. And furthermore, they don't really tie it to any metrics that they actually can quantify. I mean, the concept of reducing the heat island magnitude by, say, 3 Fahrenheit in LA, for example, you have to first of all define, well, how are you going to measure that? And what is it that you're trying to accomplish? So,
good question.
I think, I would I have a little bit of trouble with sort of thinking about what that vision should look like for a city like Phoenix, where, okay, last year we had over 300 heat-related deaths. I think a vision would be where the heat-related deaths and the associated heat-related hospitalizations go down approaching zero, right? That would be sort of a idealized vision of the future. And to get there, you deal with the heat problem, which we have some control over, but we're living in a desert environment, so we don't have total control over it. But we also deal with the access to, whether it's shade or access to air-conditioned spaces and so forth, and all of that. So I think, for me, the vision would really be tied to reduced disparities in in access to air conditioning
Mm.
and reduced adverse health outcomes for the whole population.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And and if that's accomplished by reducing the nighttime temperature by 3 Celsius, then so be it. But I think the metrics that we need to be focused on are the actual outcomes that we care about.
Rebecca, any thought? What is a 2050 Phoenix look? From your perspective, speaking to your stakeholders that you deal with, I mean, how do they see it happening in the next 20 years or 25 years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to, I could send you a link. I think it's I can't remember if it's a county level or city level initiative, but there is a push for local food production, via things like urban agriculture or maybe indoor ag in Phoenix. And it's actually for health outcomes and thinking about providing access to healthy foods. So it's actually kind of interesting that you bring that up, because it actually is a health outcome. My interest, tied to that is making sure that the push for that health outcome of just access to healthy food doesn't create more problems with other aspects of sustainability in the environment. So, I see, I guess I'm in the lucky spot where the community has already built their vision. And I can, try and think about what research might be needed to make sure that vision can be achieved. So I think I'm in a little bit different space in terms of that specific kind of work.
Gerald, with respect to scenario modeling, that's a tool that we use quite a lot or we're using more and more with respect to climate projections, but they illustrate the impacts from development and rezoning scenarios in a city, identifying potentially a suite of strategies for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And that's a really interesting platform for stakeholder exchange, solutions testing, and even critical to your point earlier, of challenging some of the planning paradigms and policy paradigms that we're stuck with that are quite siloed. What do you think about that in terms of, those are kinds of tools and techniques that are objective to a certain degree because it's based on evidence, right? Scientific evidence, but has some very powerful images with respect to potential futures for. And Shenandoah, I'm sure you've seen a million of these kind of climate projections on your coastal areas, like this is what it's going to look like in the next 25 years, that sort of thing. So thoughts on that? And then we'll open it up. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure if anybody has questions. Go ahead, Gerald.
Frankly, I don't know how effective they are, Jeffrey. I have to say, I read the New York Times to see the contribution of for the city of Miami and the protective wall they're going to put around it. So I would imagine the outcome of that would be you'd leave Miami, because basically it turned it into a massive light bulb. In other words, I don't understand why anybody would want to live there if that were the consequence. I think there's
manage free. You're talking about,
you don't always have to look forward to find out the disasters. I mean, New York is a classic example that we just don't remember the climate that we actually occupy. I mean, most of the things associated with climate change, bar sea level rise, are associated with the intensity of the existing climate. So, as David said, you don't need to consider just how hot it's going to get in the future. It's hot right now, and you're not dealing with this currently. I don't know how effective, I mean, the scenarios are necessary because you need to know what the outcomes would be. But I think they probably don't work at a community level. Maybe I'm mistaken. I think they're probably more likely to work at a policy-driven level where they tend to make big decisions about infrastructure for protection rather than day to day. If I ask somebody, I think in the communities I work about their vision for 2050, most of them would say that like a greener city, a more walkable city,
right?
A city that they find a city that grows up with them, that's not sort of fixed. Once it's built, remains in place forevermore. They want a city that actually changes and becomes less impermeable. That's fundamentally what they'd like. But I'm not sure that presenting them Dublin underwater in 2050 is really going to change much about what they do at a community level.
Okay, thank you for that. Any questions from the audience, from anybody who has breaking? So as we're seeing, as we are discussing breaking silos, every panelist has his or her, wait, sorry, let me just get this chat. As we're discussing silos, every panelist has his or her agenda and vision for the community. I'm wondering if all the panelists are to work together in a community, how do you plan to work cross disciplines with community? So yeah, so that's a similar kind of theme that we've talked about. Any other questions from the audience? Because we only have just a few minutes left and I want to be very careful with time. Or Cecilia, do you want to jump in and
I have a quick question. I think I remember one thing that struck me when David's presentation is how do you communicate with the reporters? And sometimes the information may be misleading, or the reporter doesn't know about science, and sometimes they will only report the things that they wanted to report and may not be.
oh yeah,
Right. So I think that's also an important point that we can, because a lot of these misinformation that we're seeing nowadays, and sometimes it's because there are uncertainty in science, and people may just pick on the things that they choose to believe in rather than to understand what it really means. So it's more like a comment, but I'm also curious about how would you engage in communicating your research out to the general public?
I think that's an excellent point. And, I was actually thinking about that when Gerald was talking about providing data, right? Because anytime policymakers ask us, what is going to be the impact if I implement XYZ, right? What's going to be the impact? Will it improve the environment and so forth? The answer usually starts off with, well, it's complicated, because there are a lot of pros to anything we might do, but there are always these unintended, both beneficial and adverse consequences, and weighing them and making sure that that doesn't become the entire narrative. It's like, wow, I'm studying how streets reflect sun's energy into the pedestrian. So boy, if you're a pedestrian walking across the street, you don't want a white street, you want a black street, right? And so we have to make sure that knowledge, that information gets conveyed, but that it doesn't become the only part of the story.
good point. Shrew, did you have a question or a comment? There's one of our audience members. Would you like to, you raised your hand. Whoever's raised your hand, you could speak.
Yes, hi there.
Hi.
I've been an educator and working with the large international organizations for 3 decades. I think it is wonderful that we are, right now focusing such attention on climate. It is absolutely core. My question is specifically on how is it that we can have a very cogent and specific messaging that is out to everybody, so everybody can be on the same page with just the basics of the climate being, having just a few years, this decade. This is something that I'm constantly considering, like all of us researchers, scientists, educators doing their work in kind of smaller bubbles, but that collective understanding of everybody on the planet, as much as possible, being understanding the urgency of the moment. Is there a way to, make it a succinct message and then send it with great force out to the world? So it isn't, we are not colonizing this message again, we are decolonizing it. So the global South and places that will be most affected have great agency to be part of designing, understanding and design, which takes takes its own effort so that we are not coming from high up and presenting those solutions to them. As we are seeing now, COVID as a part of climate, making its way along that same trajectory.
Who wants to take that one? That's one of those it's complicated answers. Anybody want a cogent, clear message that translates across the globe? Gerald, did you?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that particular question because, see, I do think the way we've structured, say, climate science, is not necessarily the climate that you or I experience in the place that we occupy. And I guess I would argue for a much more place-based urban science, where what is there, the context of the place, is what makes the determination about what is the appropriate decision-making at that place. When we hear an awful lot about the urban heat island, the point where you have cities in Glasgow, Scotland, talking about managing the heat island. Practically, yes, I know you can manage the urban heat island, but is it the most important thing that Glasgow faces? Probably not. I think that's true for many of the cities that are coming into being in what's called the Global South, where I think a lot of the issues they face are some very, very ordinary land use management issues associated with the placement of settlements in areas that are quite precarious, largely because of insecure ability to own land. So I think these are, I just don't think it's possible to divorce out the climate issue from the social justice, economic justice issues. And I'd much prefer a place-based discussion of those. I'd love an urban science, a genuine urban science that was transferable, but the transfer was based upon local knowledge.
All right. That sounds like a good place to stop. Cecilia, did you want to take it over?
Well, thank you everybody for the wonderful talk. And I think great discussion. I think there's a lot of questions that will be continuing on further. And I hope to engage everybody in the continuous discussion with further, exploration of all these challenges that we're currently facing. And I think inform action plans, and also it's important because we don't have a lot of time to take actions. Thank you everybody for the wonderful discussion, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you in the future webinars, and hopefully we see each other in person during our workshops.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take care.
everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.